Welcome to the Australian Boarding Schools Summit and our important discussion on perhaps the most pressing question on the lips of parents who are about to embark on the boarding schools experience, and that is, how do we pay for it? And we have guests joining us from all over Australia, starting with Alana Moller. Alana is the Federal President of the Isolated Children's Parents Association, or ICPA, and she's coming to us from Claremont in central Queensland, where she and her husband own and operate Star of Hope Station. Alana is a seasoned home educator via School of the Air and distance education, having overseen all three daughters' early schooling via those platforms. Fortunately, she holds a Bachelor of Education, which would have been very helpful, I imagine. She's a border parent, and as ICPA President, is clearly passionate about rural education and for making sure that kids from isolated areas have the same access and equality of educational opportunity as their city counterparts. Waverley Stanley is also joining us from Queensland. He's the founding director of the Yalari Foundation, which is a not-for-profit organisation that provides scholarships to support Indigenous students from regional and remote communities across Australia to attend some of the nation's top boarding schools. Waverley grew up in a region south of Brisbane and received a full scholarship to Toowoomba Grammar, where incidentally, he is the only Indigenous student ever to have finished Year 12 in the history of the 130-year history of that school. He's determined to change young Indigenous lives through helping to offer the same opportunities that he had, and to that end, Yalari supports more than 180 students in 34 partnership schools across the nation. And Jo Grinham is joining us from the King's School, where she is the registrar, a role she took up in 2020, which is not the easiest of years, I imagine, to be involved with a boarding school, and says she enjoys meeting families from not only the metro areas, but from all around Australia and the globe. She's clocked up more than 30 years of teaching experience, working with both single-sex and co-ed classes, and she's helped open a behavioural unit in Western Sydney. She's published many primary school textbooks, and she's a lecturer in job readiness for uni students. So her educational journey is one that's clearly in her blood. And finally, we have Alistair Edmunds, another passionate educator. Alistair has a particular interest in the impact of strong social environments on individual development. He's walked that walk as a sports coach and a boarding tutor at his own alma mater. And he's also worked with high schools across the country to present seminars on study skills, motivation and time management. So hopefully we get our time management right today, Alistair. Since studying at uni, Alistair has worked in many areas of EdTech and has been working with an organisation called EdStart, which works with some 600 schools around the country to help address the challenges faced by both parents and schools around school fees. So the question of how we're going to pay for it is ripe for his input. So perhaps we shall start with you, Alistair. And this is the question that raises a lot of fear for parents. Do you think that is the main fear for parents? And how can that fear be overcome?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the fear comes from the unknown, really, around school fees. It's not something that's often really talked about, to be honest. And when it is talked about, it's probably talked about in the wrong light. It's talked about this is this big annual fee that I somehow have to find, and I don't think is really possible. And that's the real attitude towards it. I'm so glad we're having an open discussion about it, and I think that's really important for parents to hear. And I don't want to really state the obvious, but I think to overcome that fear, like a lot of big changes that people undergo in life, it's simply breaking it down, not to think about it as that big annual jump that you're about to experience in your budget, but how does that look for me weekly or fortnightly and monthly, so you can make a really educated decision on how that's actually going to affect your day-to-day and how you can sustainably and proactively prepare for that and happening in your life. It's actually, from our data, we see that it comes to about 30% of families' budgets, the average independent schooling. That's a large jump, and it's undeniable that that's a big change. So being proactive and being there early, I think, can actually bring down that level of fear, and actually having a conversation about it with the people close to you, but also with your school, is super important.
So it's the old you know, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time kind of thing.
Absolutely. It sounds like it's dumbing it down a lot, but I think actually from speaking to our families and how we break down school fees for them, that first conversation, it can be quite stressful and emotional initially. But as soon as it's broken down into smaller bite-sized bits, there's a sense of just like a gasp of air. It's a relief. We can breathe. This is actually possible and we can achieve this.
And Jo, would you agree with that? As registrar at King's, you would see this fear all the time. Do you agree with that, breaking it down?
Yeah, look, I totally agree. Having also been a paying parent here at the King's School, my son finished here 4 years ago. It is a massive commitment, don't get me wrong. And, you know, I think that the worst thing that anybody can do is actually add up and what the entire journey is going to cost. It is important to be realistic, you know, and I have that conversation with many of our families that, you know, this is a wonderful school and it would be fantastic if every child and, you know, at Tudor House and up here at North Parramatta for our boys, if every child could have an experience like this, but at the end of the day, as a family, you have to be realistic. And so, look, you know, in my very first meeting with families, you know, yes, I will have the open conversation about the fee structure. You know, King's is incredibly generous with their scholarships and bursaries. One of the other things that we've really tried to do over the last, you know, 10 years, but particularly during COVID, is to try and help parents, you know, place them on a payment plan so that they're not actually having to find an enormous sum of money per term or per year, but we try and help them to know what it's going to cost when they actually break it down, you know, as you said, into small bites. And I think that that's how they have to actually look at their academic journey, particularly if they decide to choose a school like King's.
Alana, as the federal president of ICPA, this is something obviously in your remit. Is it one of the fears that hold people back from considering? And how does the ICPA get involved in helping overcome that challenge and that fear?
Yeah, look, it's certainly a fear, but I think the way we've got to look at it, it's actually not a choice. We have to send our children to boarding school. And you know that, you know, when you live in situations where our families live, you know from the day you have children that's probably going to be an expense that you're going to have, that your children will have to go away to boarding school. And so well, you know, when you get to the point, breaking it down is definitely helpful, and you can look at it each chunk. You know from the outset that you will be having that large expense coming for one child, two children, three children, you know, and it's something that I think our families have to prepare for. And if you know. It's really important for our families that our children, you know, have the best possible access to education that they have. And if you're going to give them that best possible access, you prepare for it. And, you know, whether there's assistance available or not, as a family, when you know it's coming, you make preparations for that to happen to ensure that your children get that access. And like Jo said, you know, some schools may not be a possibility for you. So you make those choices not only based on financial gains, also emotionally and physically and location and all those. There's a number of reasons, but certainly financial, you know, is definitely an issue. For ICPA, I guess our goal is to ensure that families understand that there is support and that there are various ways that they can get assistance to help them. When you know that you've got those fees coming and those sorts of things, to know that there are people there, whether it's the schools, whether it's the government, whether you know, it's philanthropic associations, those sorts of things, do have ways of helping you because they understand that geographically isolated children need to have access to education too. So our role as ICPA is to make sure our families know that and to be there to show them, hey, there's some opportunity for you to get some assistance to make sure your children have the best possible opportunities.
And speaking of the best possible opportunities, Waverley, your organisation, Yalari, is also in the business, I guess, and in the philanthropic space of helping overcome that blockage, I guess, in allowing opportunities in terms of scholarships. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you address those fears and that concern that the how we pay for it is an overwhelming question?
Yes. So I think for us at Yalari, we're a conduit, I suppose, where we provide scholarships for Indigenous children to go to private schools all around Australia. So we've got sponsors, donors and supporters that pay the school fee for us. But in partnership with our families, they pay part of that scholarship to us as an organisation based on their own income with AbStudy. So for us as an organisation, we've got sponsors, donors and supporters that will sponsor the children to go to their respective boarding schools. But then at the same time, if like you're saying, Alana, a lot of our Indigenous children, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, they don't have a high school in their respective towns. So they have to go away to either a private school or go away to do high school in, say, if you're coming from Cape York, you've got to go to somewhere in Cairns or even in Brisbane. So I think for us is just providing the funds through the sponsorship of our supporters to provide the scholarship for children to go to private schools. And that's the other thing is that, you know, it's a choice like all families. We've given the opportunity where families can have the choice of going off to a private school if they choose to. And like I say many times over, boarding school is not for every child. Every child, doesn't matter whether you're black, white, brindle, purple or corrugated.
It's a very good point. Also on that point, you touched on the distances involved and the travel and all that sort of stuff. And anybody who's ever been a parent or paid fees or had a child at a boarding school will understand that it's not just the fees. You know, there are lots and lots of different extras. How, and this is a question for all of you, but how should parents address and plan for all those extras?
Well, I can say for me personally, if I could continue on, is that we have an agreement with all of our parents and families of exactly what Yalari will pay for, what the school pay for, what is the expectation of parents. So I think we know right from the word go what everybody is contributing in some way, shape or form to the education of their children. That's what we've done strategically with our partnership schools and also our parents and children.
And Alistair, how do you think you manage those expectations?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Schools do it in lots of different ways too. Some schools will have everything all inclusive on their fee schedule and some will have extras. Schools are getting better and better at making them clear. And I think that's an important note for schools to make that as clear as possible, what possible extras could be incurred across the school calendar year. But if you don't find those extras there and you know they could exist as a parent, I think it's really important to ask the question. I think Joe would attest to the fact that that's always something schools are wanting to be open and honest about. And at EdStart, I suppose what we do is we generate payment plans for families across a year or even extended after the child finishes schools. So all those extras we actually build into the parents' payment plans. So it doesn't feel like it's a big hit. It's not something they have to pay upfront and in full. They can just gel it into their payment plan. So it's less of an impact. And that's how we sort of manage that with our families. So it doesn't hit them unawares when their budget isn't ready for it.
So I think it can be a shock if you don't understand that to start with. Joe, would you agree with that it's important to understand what those extras are going to be? That said, it's not always easy to know what your child is, going to taste test, and particularly in the early years, some kids have a crack at everything, and there's a different uniform, and so what would your response to that be?
Yeah, look, I totally agree. And we try and be as transparent. You know, if anybody who wants to go online and have a little look at our fee structure, our fees are very, very clearly written out, so there's a tuition fee, there's a boarding fee. The only other fees are really the tech fee, and there for our day boys, it will also be a lunch fee. All of that is intertwined. The only extra costs that would actually occur, particularly for a boarder, would on top of that be if there are any optional, overseas trips or overseas camps or training clinics or competitions, obviously, if a family decide to do that. And look, in saying that, we've had a number of our country boys who have made it to the top rugby rugby team and the top rowing team that recently just went to Henley. Our community did everything they possibly could to help raise the money to help those families get their boys there. I think the other thing is we try very hard to work in our communities so that, boarding families aren't paying, silly money on weekends to come down and stay, at the local hotel in Parramatta or in the city. We try where we can to pair up our day families with our boarding families so that they're able to actually billet a boarding family. It certainly helps in, integrating our boarding and our day community together. But again, that's the sort of costs that I would have with the family up front when they're inquiring about what does it cost really to send your son to the King's School. So look, there are lots of different components. Our fees are very inclusive. I know at a number of schools, my daughter went to one of those schools where, every sort of second week there was a, $7.50 for this excursion or $12.50 for this visit or a bus trip here and there. At King's, I know that it is all as inclusive, so that hopefully, as the rest of the panel said, that there's not unpleasant surprises along the way, and transparency right from the very beginning is very important.
It's an interesting conversation, I think, because you can't, as a parent, you want to be able to offer the children the ability to taste test all those different things, and it can be a little bit of a shock. But it's an interesting cross-pollination here with another panel that we have today about building a community away from the place you call home. And I think having that community there to support those who are perhaps doing it tough. Alana, the ICPA, would that be something that the ICPA would be keen to encourage parents to do, is to ask those questions about the extras?
Yeah, look, I think schools, in our experience, are very good at, with the costs associated with school, and they can, provide assistance in that regard and do what they can do for that. But certainly, I think what Jo said is a bit of a segue to what I've been thinking as the conversation's gone on. It's not only the school expenses, it's the expenses of accommodation when you go to visit your children. It's the travel to get there. You might have a 10-hour drive to get to your children. We know what fuel prices are like, so while the school can assist with a certain number of those expenses and work out payment plans and those sorts of things, there's so much more to sending your children to boarding school than just those school fees, because and it comes down to having to make choices about, okay, maybe I can't attend this awards ceremony because it's going to cost me too much to stay in accommodation and those sorts of things. So I guess it's great that there's support available in schools, and it's absolutely appreciated that there's support available through the Assistance for Isolated Children to help with those school fees, all those boarding fees and all those things. But it still doesn't take away from the fact that sending your children to boarding school is an expensive exercise, and regardless of where you go, because and you mentioned when we started the conversation about the distance, and it's because of that distance. It's absolutely because of that distance, because you can't just zip up there and watch an awards ceremony for an hour and come home again. It's not that simple. And so as a family, and back to what you mentioned about the community, as a family, you need to make sure that your children, when they're at boarding school, have got a community around them, so that when you can't be there because you can't afford it or because you're not able to get there, that they have got people there to back them up and people to support them as well. And like you said, it all links together. Everything links together, and everything is related to everything else.
There's no doubt that is an expensive exercise, and we could talk all day about the benefits of that investment. But there are times when things go wrong, or there's a change in circumstance, or something else happens that makes the fee structure or those extra costs very difficult. How best do you think parents can have that conversation? And this is a two-pronged question, one to the schools themselves. How do you encourage parents to have that conversation? And for the others of you, how do you think parents should approach that conversation to take the humiliation out of it? Because it can be very distressing to be in that position.
Actually, I might jump in if that's okay. You know, with all of my travel that I do out in the country, I have to say our farming families are the foundation of our school. You know, it was a farm before it was the King's School. It was built on a love story, a family love story. And for us, that will always be the foundation of who we are. And as I say to all country families, who I think are probably the proudest people that we have in this country, but the most needed, is that you must not have a conversation. It doesn't really matter who you have that first conversation with. You know, if I'm the first person that you meet on a road trip, or Ben Chadwick, who's our director of boarding, or, you know, it doesn't matter who that first conversation and the first person is that you have that conversation with, but you must have the conversation. We really want you to be able to know that we care. We have some incredible, generous, I guess, hereditary blood in this school. And, you know, for us, the last thing we want is for country families to be suffering in silence. I remember the year before last when we went to AgQuip at Gunnedah, the marketing team had put 3 bales of hay on our stand. And it took me literally 2 days to give those 3 bales away, because every farming family said to me, "Oh, Jo, there's got to be somebody worse off than us." You know, our farming families in this country are, you know, the unsung heroes in our respect, and from what we see. And so we just say, have the conversation. There are means and there are procedures that you can be a part of. And if you go through the process, you'll meet with the bursar, and there will always be additional aid. You know, we've seen that during COVID, how generous our school was then. We've seen it during droughts and floods and mice plagues. And for us, the help will always go to our farming families first. And so all I can say is it doesn't actually matter who you have the conversation with. It might start with an email if that's where you're most comfortable. If you're not comfortable having that conversation with the bursar because you don't know who that is, come and have the conversation with me. Have it with Ben Chadwick. Have it with your child's housemaster. Have it with your child's mentor. The conversation will then eventually stream back to me, and I will then have that conversation with the bursar, and we'll set up a meeting, you know, at a time and a place, you know, where you feel most comfortable. But for us, if we don't have that conversation, we can't help, because we don't know that there's an issue. So the conversation is absolutely a very, very important part of reaching out. And, you know, we want all our families to know that, you know, we're here, the village is here, and we're here to help.
I think what you said there about suffering in silence is really important, and that's not just as in terms of school fees either. It's across the board, and it's also important to point out that it's not just farming families that struggle, although obviously those are the ones that come to mind because of drought and circumstances and the distances involved. But there are other sorts of circumstances. You know, people in business, and the downturns in the economy. And people who struggle to get their kids there in the first place. Waverley, how would you encourage parents to have that conversation, perhaps with Yalari or with the schools?
It's exactly what you're saying there, Jo, and I agree with it. You know, it takes a whole community to educate a child, and that's one of our taglines. And I think the opportunity to go to a private school or to a boarding school away from your home communities or your towns or your properties, you know, it is a partnership between families, and I look at it as a four-legged stool. And this is the analogy that we have at Yalari, that there's the student, the family, the school, and Yalari. And if you take one of those legs out of the equation, well, you've got a wobbly old chair. So I think it is about being open and transparent regarding all your conversations with your families, because at the end of the day is that if there was a high school, you would be paying the fees if your child was going to, and you made the choice of them going to the local high school, you're still going to be part of their education. So from a private school point of view, what we encourage a lot of our families to do, and where we select our children to go to their respective boarding schools, is that they've also got family nearby that can take them out on leave. That alleviates a bit of the pressure for the families that are away from that might be 1,200 kilometres away from their children. They've got family nearby. The other thing then is that we have student support officers and staff nearby where our children, so our family members, when they come down for sport or for speech day, they got another resource where they can stay with some of our staff. So we've taken that into consideration. It's a bit like Sunday Laser Review in Sydney. They've got Barangaroo House out there. And, for some families, when they come down from regional New South Wales or from Darwin, they have an opportunity to be accommodated at the school, go to the facilities, or whether it's speech day or whether it's a sporting event, and then go back home. But right from the word go, we're in partnership together with families and children to give them the best education at our private schools all around Australia. So it is about being open and honest and transparent with conversations, with everything, because it's a journey. And like I said before, boarding school is not for every child and for every family. And there is accountability and there is responsibility and there's also sacrifices.
Alistair, is this conversation, this difficult conversation that sometimes needs to be had, is that something that EdStart factors into the communications that you have with prospective parents or parents?
Absolutely. I think we actually see it more where we manage the full fee management of a school, where essentially we're managing all the fees at the school and all the parents at said schools. And we've actually done case studies where we find that for every family that is speaking to their school about their financial hardship and thinking about even pulling their kid out of the school, which is a big step, and people do consider that, there's another family that isn't telling the school, but is telling us. So what we actually have to do, because sometimes being a third party, these are smaller communities. Some boarding schools aren't your big private schools in your city. Some are smaller communities, and there's increased social pressures when that happens in terms of having that conversation. And what that can often mean is the school never actually knows, which, as Joe said, we really need the school to know. And what we'll often do is just help facilitate that conversation, like Joe said, make sure it's just talk them through the problem first. I think that's a big step, as Joe said, that first conversation, even if it's with us, and then we'll take that to the school. And we can often speak about the things I think that we've just spoken about in terms of the community and making it's a village. Schools more and more so are wanting diverse boarding schools. They want a diverse boarding house, and they think every kid is a key part of that community. So having the conversation, your child is a cornerstone of that boarding school and that community. So you need to have that conversation because the school really does care. And we find that when we speak to schools and they don't know about a family's struggles, they are shocked and immediately want to find a solution as quick as possible, or at least just have the conversation as early as possible, so families don't go down bad paths, which again, the reality is we also see, because school is emotional. It's education for your child. It's the most powerful investment you can make. So sometimes we see families go down multiple credit cards or bad personal loans, and schools and us, we really want to avoid families going down that path, because in the long run, it's not going to help the child or the family as a whole.
Alana, the ICPA would obviously have some significant experience in this space with those difficult conversations. What would be your advice to parents in having those conversations?
Yeah, look, I think Joe hit the nail on the head for many of our families when she gave the example of bales of hay. If a school goes to Joe, Joe says, no, I'm okay. Fred down the road's worse off than me. And families are proud and they don't like to ask for help because they know that they want to educate their children. So they do choose paths, and not only on the financial side, Alistair, they'll pull children out of boarding school before they will go and ask for help, or they'll make choices that are going to then impact their children down the track because they can't find another way out. So we certainly do, encourage families to, make sure that they are looking for ways that they can help, can get assistance, and there are, government assistance available, and schools have assistance and those sorts of things. But on top of that, when we speak to government, and we've seen in the past in a few situations where there's been, drought payments made available, or an example is the Northwest Queensland flood when that happened in a few years ago where there was some assistance made available to assist with school costs for families, but the way that that was implemented was by schools. And the challenge that schools had with that being implemented by schools is they had to go to families and ask them that question: are you struggling? We've got money here to help you. But the families wouldn't say so. Mm-hmm. So what our advice is to government and to other various organisations is you need to go to the source. You need to go to the family. If you want to help families, you need to go to them, because they're not going to tell their schools. They're not going to tell, because they are too proud. And so I guess it's a challenge for schools, I guess, to figure out how do we get our families to talk to us. And, from our side as parents and, as representing parents, we do encourage that to happen. And we do let them know that there is assistance if you just go looking for it, or just go and ask for it. But schools and Alistair's organisation, Waverley's organisation, can act as conduits for that, and to make sure that those people who really do need that assistance aren't missing out, because they'll miss out before they come forward themselves in a lot of situations.
Alistair touched on the importance of diversity in schools and encouraging that diverse boarding community. Obviously, the fees and the cost of it is a factor in encouraging that diversity. Waverley, if I could throw to you, how can schools better encourage diversity, particularly with Indigenous kids and Indigenous communities?
I think it's still the choice, Jennifer, that in regards to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families choosing to have their children educated. So like in my case, from my background, when back in 1979, my grade 7 teacher, Mrs. Rosemary Bishop, gave me the option of going off to boarding school and organising a boarding school scholarship for me at Toowoomba Grammar School. Going to Toowoomba Grammar School was not on the horizon for me on a scholarship back from 1980 to 84. So a lot of our families, this for the first time in their lives, this is the first choice in their families to go off to a private school. So I think and I think for us as an organisation, it's picking the right child with the right school, with the right family support. And it is making that choice, and where from a diversity point of view, we wanted our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children to be at private schools where, yes, you might be a minority, but they are part of the bigger social fabric of Australia, where the children that are on our Yalari scholarship and other Indigenous children, that when they go onto the schools, they're part of another culture. They're part of a boarding school culture. They're part of a team culture. They're part of their boarding house culture. And that gives them an opportunity of being, well-rounded young people, all children at these private schools. And I think it's an education for everybody. It doesn't matter what nationality, whether you're the First Nation student, whether you're 7th, 8th, 9th generation of, or whether you're a new Australian, you've got an opportunity of getting the world-class education. And for us as Australians, it doesn't matter whether you're getting a state school, public school, private school, alternative school. We as Australians should have an expectation of world-class education at all of our schools, no matter what nationality you are. That's something that allows us to take a fuller resource within this country of educational excellence, no matter where we are.
It's a very good point. And Joe, can I ask you how King's encourages that diversity across the broad spectrum of cultures, ethnicity and backgrounds?
Yeah, I think it's a relevant, such a relevant question. I mean, I think for here at King's, if you look down into our playground really reflects, the globe. And Waverley, certainly one of my projects at the moment, and my passion project at the moment, is to, work and hopefully down the track have a relationship and a closer relationship with you guys. At the at the moment, our King's execs and our King's family are very much trying to investigate what it would be best looking like for our Indigenous program of the future. Is it best working with somebody like you who's going to, help us find the right boys for our school? Or, perhaps it might look different for King's. Perhaps it's actually going to be us going to them. I know at the moment, probably telling you something totally top secret here, but, at the moment we're actually trying to sort of investigate what it would be like and what it would look like for us to actually build a school up in the Northern Territory. From the research, I guess, that we've done is that, as you said, it's not going to always suit every single child to come to the big smoke, to come to a school like King's. We've got to make sure that we are, ready to be able to give, particularly the Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander, boys. I feel we've still got work to do here in our community to understand them before we bring them in. Global diversity is huge for us. We are an traditional Anglican school, but our Christian mission statement in the last 10 years has changed to, it's a matter of respecting one another and making the world a better place. You name the religion or culture, it's here at King's. The boys will go to a traditional Anglican chapel once a week, but they may sit next to a Muslim boy or a Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Catholic, Maronite, you name it, they're all here. I guess for us, it is our pledge to make each of these boys better humans. But certainly, our scholarship and bursary project, I feel really quite excited because, the school has introduced some compassionate scholarships in the last 12 months. I feel really excited about that. That's, hearts on our sleeves sort of kinds of things. And I feel that we are really working hard to, change, I guess, how people perceive scholarships and bursaries.
That's actually a very good point. Sorry, Alistair, you were going to jump in there?
I was just going to quickly sort of echo the thoughts. I suppose I spoke to my old school quite recently, Brisbane Grammar, so out on the sporting fields against Toowoomba Grammar, Waverley. But what they said more recently to me is they want that diversity and that they think that's super important. I think more so as well, it's parents, full fee paying parents expect that. They expect that of the boarding schools to provide those opportunities to families who are more in need of whatever it is, a bursary or support to go to those schools, so that their child comes out of that experience with a well-rounded community and a well-rounded experience as a whole. I think that's something that I'm hearing left, right and centre at the moment. We've got oodles of work to do as a society to shift it where it needs to be, but I think that attitude shift has begun.
I think that's a terrific point. And honestly, we could talk about this sort of thing all day. It's an important conversation. But I would really just like to touch on scholarships, which a number of you have mentioned. Just throwing back to you, Alana, parents need to investigate. There are all kinds of different scholarships out there, aren't there? So parents need to look at those different options.
Yeah, certainly, and that's a factor that comes into choosing a school quite often. Whether you can access a scholarship or whether you can go to the location of the school and sit in a scholarship exam or all those sorts of things. And I think it's something that people go to. It's probably perhaps one of the top things where people would look for assistance, and because you don't really have to indicate that you're in a bad situation or anything. You can just go, okay, well, I'm just going to go and sit the child's going to go and sit the exam with the other 150 people who are sitting the exam and that sort of thing. So it's certainly think families choose that. And just back to the diversity question, it's education's holistic. And that's when you're choosing a boarding school or you're choosing when you send your child away to school, it's because you can't give that holistic education necessarily in the situation that you're in. And so when you're looking for a boarding school, when families looking for a boarding school, you look for all those things. And we're talking about financial wise at the moment, and so do they offer scholarships? How can we access those scholarships? But then, okay, if we're paying X amount of fees, what are we going to, get for that, and how is our school going to support us? And perhaps it's not a case necessarily, as I said earlier, that people actually go and ask their schools. If you know that your children have to go to boarding school from the day they're born, you start looking pretty early, and you do your own investigations. And it's really good to know that a school might have all that information available to you, because there's definitely experiences where you can't find that information from schools, or schools, and whether that's because there's a personality issue that a school doesn't give the right information or whatever. And while there may be some situations where people know that we're using this school, that's it, that's where we're going, dad's an old boy, or those sorts of things, I think perhaps it's becoming more the way a situation of you investigate further to make sure that the choice you make can give you the best possible opportunities. And if it's a school that you've done a scholarship exam and got a scholarship because the exam went well, that's the choice that you make. And it comes down to personal situations, and each family is different, and you can't say that because this school has the best scholarship that's necessarily the best school for your child either. So recognition that that's great that your school's doing that, but it still doesn't fit with the ideals that my child needs. So then the family needs to go looking for other sources of assistance if they can't get a scholarship at the particular school that works best for their child, and that sort of thing.
And I think scholarships, and I've had, I was on a scholarship when I went to school, and both my children were fortunate enough to get scholarships. I think the attitudes between then and now in terms of accessing scholarships, and some schools do it better than others, but I think there has been a shift in the stigma of being a scholarship student. Waverley, I'd like to leave the last question, that point to you, because we are getting to the end of our time. That celebration of young people who are on a scholarship, that's important, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very important. I think we've at Yalari we've I suppose formed a Yalari family where all of our children that are, and we've got 460 alumni around Australia that since we started in 2006 with our first 3 children at Toowoomba Grammar School and the Glennie School. So I think, but you're part of a bigger family. My brothers at Toowoomba Grammar School, from grade 8 to grade 12, they didn't discriminate against me. They knew me as Stan, and that was my nickname. And I've got a fundraising dinner tomorrow where we've got about 780 people coming to Brisbane Convention Centre, and we celebrate the achievements of these Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children at their respected boarding schools. But I'm so grateful that the life I had as an Indigenous man to go to a private school, and knowing fully well that there was a lot of sacrifices my family made, like all families. That choice is still a choice. And you will do everything in your power to have your children at these respected boarding schools. And I'm a father, my son went to Toowoomba Grammar School, and Waverley was not on a Yalari scholarship. He went to Toowoomba Grammar School, and I paid for him. And my youngest daughter, I've got 4 children. My youngest daughter went to the Glennie School. So, and they weren't on a Yalari scholarship. So I think as educators, and for me personally, as an Aboriginal man in this country, I specifically wanted our partnership at private schools because I wanted our children to be part of every part of social fabric of Australia, and I didn't want them to be further segregated away from Australian society. And the education for them is that when they they can walk into any room, like tomorrow night, I will have 780 people at this dinner. I will have 130 children from Queensland schools going to this dinner where, and the education for them is not only found in 4 walls of a classroom. They're going to be educated on how to hold a conversation, how to be proud when they wear their school blazer, to be proud of the school that they represent, and to know fully well that, I'm coming up to 40 years in 2 years' time for my reunion at Toowoomba Grammar School. And my experience at Toowoomba Grammar School was the best because I had blokes that looked after me and we looked after each other. And it wasn't a matter about the colour of your skin. They just accepted me for who I was as an individual and as a friend and as a mate. And I'm so very grateful that if it wasn't for Mrs. Rosemary Bishop to have a scholarship and for me to go to Toowoomba Grammar School, and I repaid Mrs. Bishop in regards to every student that's on my scholarship program now is on the Rosemary Bishop scholarship. And that happened from 1979. And I had You know, last Tuesday, I shared the 79th birthday with Mrs. Bishop saying, you know, we're still honouring you each and every day because of what you've done for me, you know, 40 years ago. So that scholarship of Yalari was because of my experience at Toowoomba Grammar School. And I know a lot of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people might not have had the best experience, and a lot of non-Indigenous children, Sudanese children, may not have the best experience at boarding school. But for me personally, it was life-changing and a life different pathway for me through education that gives me a purpose to get out of bed each and every day.
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful place to end. Thank you so much, Waverley, and thank you all of you. This is really important conversation, and I think it's one that we all need to continue to have as part of the boarding schools community. Thank you so much again for joining us, and thank you for tuning in for our panel on how to pay for it. Don't be frightened, ask the questions. The takeaway, I think, is that scholarships are there for the taking, and the questions need to be asked and the discussions need to be had. Thanks for joining us.